The afternoon was quiet, almost peaceful until it wasn't. A black woman stood alone in the park, minding her own business. When the silence around her shifted, eyes turned. Footsteps quickened, and within moments, a simple walk became the beginning of something she never saw coming. What happened next wasn't a misunderstanding. It was a reveal of the prejudice hiding in plain sight. But the officers who confronted her had no idea who they were dealing with, no idea how far their actions would echo. And the moment they realized the truth, it was already too late. Before we begin, stories like this matter to you, stories that reveal truths many try to ignore. Make sure you subscribe and share this video. Your voice helps keep these stories alive. She had always loved quiet spaces, places where the world seemed to breathe at a softer pace, where the noise of responsibility loosened its grip. For Lena Caldwell, the park had been that space for years, before anyone knew her title, before cameras followed her husband's campaign trail, before the security briefings and public appearances. There had been mornings when she walked the winding paths in peace. Those simple strolls had become her sanctuary. A small escape from the constant pressure that came with being connected to political power, pressure she had never fully asked for. Despite everything surrounding her now, Lena remained grounded in who she was long before the world cared. A former community counselor. A woman who spent hours listening to the stories of forgotten neighborhoods, children who felt invisible, and families who fought for years against systems that overlooked them. She had carried those voices with her into every room she stepped into, even when those rooms became larger, more polished, more intimidating. It was that part of her, the part that had never forgotten where she came from, that pulled her back to the same park again and again. It was early afternoon when she decided she needed a break from the noise of the city. Her day had started with endless meetings, a wave of news commentary, and a push from the governor's staff urging her to attend an upcoming dinner. Oh, she loved her husband, but she didn't love the world he now lived in. The attention, the cameras, the speculation, she had mastered the smile. Still, she had never grown comfortable with the constant watching. Sometimes she wondered if people saw her at all, or only the shadow of her husband's office. So she slipped out quietly, choosing instead to visit the old park on the east side. It was the most glamorous part of town, certainly not the one the reporters or photographers paid attention to, but it was the one that felt like home. Towering trees arched overhead, their branches forming a canopy that filtered the autumn light into soft, shifting patterns on the ground. The sound of kids playing drifted from the far side of the field. A father jogged by, offering a polite nod. A couple sat on a nearby bench, leaving space between themselves and the world, sharing a moment free from distractions. Lena inhaled the air deeply. It carried a comforting mix of crisp leaves, faint exhaust from the nearby street, and the distant sweetness of a vendor selling roasted almonds. She didn't need anything extravagant. Peace didn't require perfection. It just required space. She wasn't dressed like someone whose life brushed shoulders with governors, mayors, or political advisors. She wore a simple jacket, nothing expensive, nothing flashy, paired with jeans and her favorite worn sneakers. She liked blending in. Disappearing into the scenery felt more natural than standing on a stage. She wasn't trying to look important. She wasn't trying to be noticed at all. But the world wasn't always kind to black women who preferred to exist. As she walked along the path, she observed the small details she'd always loved. A child crouched beside the pond, fascinated by a pair of ducks drifting through the calm water. A couple of teenagers tossed a football back and forth, laughing when one slipped in the wet grass. A dog barked, chasing squirrels with hopeful determination. Life unfolded around her with the same gentle rhythm it had always held in this quiet corner of the city. Yet beneath that calm, something else moved, something subtle, something she couldn't quite put into words. A glance from across the field, a shift in the air. A sense she had learned to recognize since childhood, long before titles, long before visibility. The silent tension that came when someone watched for the wrong reason. It wasn't loud. It wasn't obvious, but it was there. Her steps slowed slightly. Not enough to signal fear. Not enough to draw attention. Just enough to acknowledge that her instincts weren't imagining things. She scanned the nearby area, taking in every figure around her. Families, teens, the jogger again, now slowing his pace. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the feeling didn't fade. She reminded herself that she had come here for peace, not suspicion. The world had taught her vigilance, but she refused to let it steal every moment from her. She was allowed this space. She was allowed this breath. She was allowed to exist without having to explain herself. She continued walking, though the air felt a little heavier now. Lena wasn't unaware of how people sometimes treated her when they didn't know who she was married to. She had experienced the polite dismissals, the cautious distance, the sudden coldness that slipped into someone's expression when they made assumptions about her. She'd spent years refusing to shrink under their gaze. Still, no amount of social status ever erased the reality she lived in before any of those titles existed. Some days, she wondered if the world ever truly changed, or just changed the angle at which it looked at her. As she reached the quieter end of the park, she stepped onto a narrow path shaded by a long row of oaks. Leaves rustled above her, falling softly in slow spirals. This had always been her favorite part, the part that felt untouched by the city's rush, the part where she could hear her own thoughts clearly. But the tension followed her, a presence moving somewhere behind her, steady, unhurried, deliberate. She didn't turn around, not yet. Years of navigating spaces where she was treated differently had taught her how to read the world without giving it more ammunition. She kept walking, each step measured, her breath steady. The sound grew clearer, the crunch of gravel under boots, the faint click of something metal. Not chaotic, not rushed. Almost purposeful. She finally reached for her phone, not to call anyone, but to keep it in her hand. A small reassurance. A silent preparation. She still didn't turn. Lena had always trusted her instincts, especially when they whispered warnings. But she also believed in giving the world the benefit of the doubt, that not every glance was a threat, not every sound was danger, not every stranger carried intent. Still, the presence behind her didn't disappear. The path curved gently, and as she rounded the bend, the shapes behind her shifted through the corner of her vision. It's of figures now, broad frames, uniform-colored shadows. Officers. It wasn't unusual to see police in public spaces. They patrolled the area often. Many people found comfort in their presence. But Lena felt no such comfort. Their pace matched hers a little too closely. Their path mirrored hers a little too precisely. And the heaviness in the air, that quiet, unspoken pull of being monitored, pulled tighter. She slowed her steps again as she reached a bench near the pond. A mother and her child sat at the far end, feeding small bits of bread to the ducks. The child giggled when a duck splashed a little too close. The moment felt grounding, normal, safe. She sat down at the opposite end of the bench, keeping her gaze on the water. The officers continued forward, but instead of passing by casually, they drifted slightly closer, their attention narrowing. There was no conversation, no greetings exchanged, no visible reason for their interests, but their path curved inward. The mother beside her noticed too. The woman's posture shifted, subtle but noticeable. A protective instinct, a quiet alertness. She pulled her child closer and lowered her voice, whispering something the child seemed too young to understand. Lena wasn't a stranger to moments like this. The atmosphere is changing, the energy thickens, the unspoken question hovering in the air. What are you doing here? A question nobody asked aloud, but one she had heard her entire life. She didn't move. She didn't stand. She didn't run. Every part of her training, every speech, every community meeting, every reminder she'd ever given others, told her to remain calm, to remain steady, stay grounded in the reality that she had done nothing wrong. Yet the weight of their gaze carved through the moment like a blade. She felt the mother quietly slip away with her child, leaving space behind. And suddenly, the bench that felt peaceful minutes earlier now carried a chill. The officers stood several feet away, watching her with the quiet intensity of predators, assessing their next move. There was no sign of danger around her. No disturbance. No complaint. Just her. Her, alone. In a park she'd walked for years. Her hand tightened on the phone. Not out of fear, but out of familiarity. A tool. A safeguard. A reminder that she was not powerless. Still, something inside her whispered that this moment, this exact second, was the beginning of the shift. The point where everyday life cracked. The moment where the story stopped being peaceful and became something else. She didn't know why they were watching. She didn't understand what assumption they had made. But she knew the look in their eyes, the look that didn't see her as a woman enjoying a quiet afternoon. The look that didn't see the decades of work she had poured into the communities they supposedly protected. The look that didn't see her humanity. Just a silhouette, a suspicion, a target. Across the lake, the wind picked up. Leaves are scattered over the walkway. The sky dimmed slightly behind a passing cloud. Nature shifted with the tension, as if responding to it, echoing it. Lena's life, until this moment, had been a delicate balance of calm and chaos, public duty and private peace. But something was unraveling now, something subtle, yet unmistakably authentic. And while she still believed she could control the moment, she could feel the world around her whispering that she couldn't. Not this time. She took one more steady breath. Because deep down beneath the calm, beneath the rationalization, beneath her attempt to brush off the uneased, she knew exactly what was coming. She had felt it before. She recognized the quiet before the storm, the kind that didn't ask permission, the kind that changed everything. The air shifted in a way Lena couldn't ignore anymore. What began as a faint disturbance, the quiet sense of being watched, was no longer subtle. The two officers no longer pretended to patrol casually. Their focus had narrowed, their path angled toward her with a silent intensity that made each second feel heavier than the one before. The world around her kept moving. A stroller rolled over a patch of uneven path. A group of teens crossed the field, loud with laughter. A dog barked at a squirrel skittering up a tree. Life continued, unbothered and unaware. But inside the small space where Lena sat, something invisible locked into place. A shift. A tension. A quiet threat growing larger with every breath. She stood up from the bench, not hurriedly, not timidly, just enough to remind herself that she wasn't trapped. Her feet found the path again. Her stride remained steady, controlled, but every instinct whispered that she was moving into a moment she couldn't step out of. The officers adjusted their pace. One is slightly ahead, the other is slightly behind. A subtle flank, kind she had seen before, and not toward criminals, but toward assumptions. Toward people who fit a description, even if the description existed only in their heads. The path narrowed. A row of tall hedges lined the left side. A slope with thick, tangled brush bordered the right. No families, no joggers, no witnesses close enough to catch the quiet shift happening behind her. Still, she kept walking. She refused to feed fear. She declined to give the world the satisfaction of shrinking, but the space tightened with every step. She could feel their eyes crawling across her back, searching for something, anything to justify their presence. She had seen that hunger before. The hunger to be right about someone they had already judged. She had seen it in stores, in airports, and at upscale events where she was mistaken for hired help rather than a guest. But here, in this quiet stretch of the park, that hunger carried weight, authority, power, the kind that didn't need proof, the kind that didn't ask permission. Her breath stayed deep. Measured, she reached the fork in the path where the trees thinned. Just slightly, a clearing opened to the right. A small playground sat in the distance, still dotted with families. The sight tightened something in her chest, not fear, but hope. Witnesses, humanity, eyes that might counter the ones behind her. She turned toward the clearing. The officers adjusted again, following, matching, closing in. The wind pressed against her jacket as if urging her forward. Leaves skittered across the ground like tiny warnings. She walked faster without appearing rushed, a delicate balance. Balance she had learned from years of navigating spaces that questioned her right to exist peacefully. Her phone was still in her hand, not raised, not recording, but present. A lifeline if she needed it. A shield if they forced her to use it. She moved toward the playground, but the officers drifted into her path with a slow inevitability, subtle, then bolder, then unmistakable. She was no longer imagining it. They were positioning themselves and cutting off her escape routes, creating a pocket of isolation within a space that moments earlier had felt open and free. A man tossing a frisbee to his dog looked over briefly, his brows pulled together, a flicker of awareness, but he turned away, resuming his game. The world was full of people who noticed injustice only long enough to acknowledge it, never long enough to intervene. Lena's pulse steadied. She didn't panic. She refused to give them that. But the air thickened with an unspoken accusation, one she had done nothing to earn. And then it happened. A shift in footsteps, a surge of presence. The officers moved in closer, too close. Not enough for contact, just enough to make their intention unmistakable. Her heart tightened not from fear of them, but from the realization that this moment was no longer avoidable. Something was unfolding, something she hadn't chosen. And the officers carried themselves with the confidence of people convinced they were justified. The clearing widened. The playground grew nearer. But the officers quickened, stepping ahead of her path, forcing her to slow. Forcing her to acknowledge the pressure they were applying. They stepped in front of her. One is slightly angled, the other squared off. A wall is forming. A barrier is closing. A silent message passed between them. Her steps halted. It's not because she wanted to. Because they had forced the moment to stop. A breeze swept through the clearing. Voices from the playground drifted across the space distant, unaware, too far to see truly. The world carried on, oblivious. In the pocket of tension between her and the officers, something heavier than words settled. A judgment formed without evidence, a threat without cause. The weight of authority is used not for protection, but for intimidation. The one in front of her stepped closer. The other closed in from behind. A box. A trap. Her fingers tightened around her phone. Her breath stayed controlled. Her posture lifted with quiet dignity. She had done nothing wrong. But innocence didn't matter to people who had already made up their minds. Her jacket caught in a sudden tug from behind, not violent yet, but aggressive enough to jolt her. A shock rippled through her body, not from physical pain, but from the violation of it, the invasion, the presumption, the audacity. Her feet staggered a half-step, her breath hitched. She felt the fabric strain. And in that split second, everything changed. The officer behind her gripped the fabric, and with a harsh jerk, the seam split. The sound shot through the air like a rip of dignity. A tear not just in clothing, but in the illusion that she could move through this world untouched by assumptions. The rip echoed louder than it should have, a violent punctuation, a rupture. The park seemed to freeze, a moment suspended between violation and consequence. Her mind raced, but not with fear, with clarity. This was the moment. The shift. The crack in everyday life she'd sensed coming. She stepped forward out of the torn jacket, grounding herself. Her breath steadied. Her spine straightened. Her heart hammered not with panic, but with fury, the quiet, controlled kind that burned instead of exploding. The officer stepped closer again, not expecting resistance, and not expecting composure, and not expecting her. And that arrogance only sharpened the moment. The sound of the tear drew attention now. A few people looked over. A jogger slowed. A father paused as he lifted his toddler onto a swing. Eyes turned, confused, uncertain, assessing, but still too distant. Still too late to undo the violation. The officer's posture stiffened. They hadn't expected witnesses. They hadn't expected the tear to echo across the clearing. A flicker of uncertainty crossed their faces. Not remorse, but the uncomfortable awareness that attention was shifting toward them. Still, they held their ground. Puffed chests, rigid shoulders, authority projected like armor. Lena's thoughts sharpened. She knew exactly how these situations could spiral out of control. One misunderstanding layered onto another, one assumption compounding into force. One wrong move interpreted as a threat. She didn't move. She didn't turn away. She didn't back down. Her dignity towered over their intimidation. But the officers stepped in again, tightening the shrinking gap around her. The fabric of her torn jacket dangled from one of their hands, a symbol of the unnecessary force they had convinced themselves was justified. The playground laughter faded. The wind stilled. The world seemed to lean in. A cyclist slowed on the path nearby, eyes lingering. A couple walking their dog hesitated. People sensed something unfolding, something wrong, something tense but not yet explosive enough to draw full engagement. But the officers pressed forward, trying to regain control of a situation they had created. Their energy shifted from assumption to irritation, from irritation to dominance, from dominance to escalation. The one nearest to her stepped closer, invading her personal space with the confidence of someone who expected the world to accept his version of events without question. Lena felt the heat rise beneath her skin, not just from the injustice of the moment, but from the realization that each second pushed them closer to something irreversible. She steadied her breath. Her vision sharpened. Her instincts screamed warnings she had spent her entire life learning to read. A wrong gesture could be twisted. Defensive movement could be misinterpreted. A plea for space could be reframed as aggression. So she stayed still, grounded, unbroken. The officers closed in anyway. Their aggression wasn't loud, it was silent, calculated, and masked beneath the authority of their uniforms. Their faces tightened, their jaws tensed. The space around her shrank again as they prepared to push the moment further. Their actions weren't rooted in safety, not rooted in concern, not rooted in any actual reason. Their actions were rooted in something far simpler, the belief that she didn't belong, she didn't look right, that she fit a narrative they had created, and they were determined to force her into it. The crowd's awareness grew. A teenage girl pulled out her phone. A man at the picnic table stood. A dog walker paused mid-step. The world shifted a little closer, but not close enough, not soon enough. The officers moved again, one circling behind, the other stepping forward, closing the final inches of space that separated authority from exploitation. The clearing felt tight now, breathless, electric with danger. Lena's heart drummed slow and deep, not frantic, controlled, but charged with the awareness that something irreversible hovered in the air, something that could flip her life in a moment. Then a voice echoed from across the clearing, sharp, commanding, cutting through the rising tension like a blade. The officers froze. Only for a fraction of a second, but long enough for the shift to be felt. A new presence entered the scene. Someone running. Footsteps rapid, urgent, heads turned. The crowd pivoted. Whispers spread. The officers stiffened. Their posture faltered. Their confidence shook. Because the man running toward them, breathless, determined, wide-eyed with horror, was someone they knew. Someone whose presence alone forced them to change their stance. Someone whose status snapped their arrogance in half. But before the crowd could see clearly, before the officers could react, before Lena could fully process the sudden turn, another ripping sound cracked through the air. Not fabric this time. Tension, authority, pride, breaking. And in that split second, the moment teetered on the edge of collapse. The crowd surged closer. The officers' faces drained. The air thickened with a shockwave of realization, one that hadn't fully hit yet, but we were moments away from detonating everything. The man approaching was not ordinary. It was not random. He was not a bystander. The officers finally understood that the woman they had cornered was not the woman they thought she was. But they didn't know the truth yet. Not fully. Not entirely. They were seconds away from discovering it. And when they did, their world would implode. The street felt too quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the dangerous kind. The type that presses against your ribs and makes your breath feel borrowed. The kind that tells you something is about to break. Marcus stood there, palms trembling, his voice caught somewhere between fear and disbelief. Blue and red lights pulsed against his skin, painting him as something he wasn't, something they had already decided he was. A threat, a problem, a suspect. Even though all he had done was walk home, the officer stepped closer, heavy boots grinding into wet pavement, one hand resting not casually, but deliberately on the holster of his gun. His jaw clenched as if he were holding back the decision he had already made. Turn around, hands where I can see them. Marcus didn't move. He couldn't. His legs felt like they were sinking into the ground. His breath left in shaky clouds. He could hear his heartbeat in his ears, loud, uneven, terrified. Officer, I live right here. He pointed shakily at the small brick building across the street. I'm just trying to get home, that's all. But the officer's face didn't change. No recognition, no hesitation, no humanity, only suspicion, only fear, but not his own. The officer took another step. Another. Every footstep sounded like a countdown. From somewhere behind the squad car, A second officer emerged, yelling, "I said turn around." Marcus lowered his hands slowly. "Please, don't. I didn't do anything. Don't move." The second officer lifted his weapon halfway, aiming directly at Marcus's chest. And just like that, the world shrank into a tunnel. No sounds, no buildings, no witnesses. Just the cold circle of a barrel and the horrifying understanding of how quickly a life can be erased. Marcus swallowed hard, tears threatening to spill. He had grown up hearing stories of boys who didn't return home, of men who were mistaken identities, of fathers who never met their newborn children. But stories were different when you became the one standing in the spotlight of danger. He raised his hands higher. "Please, just listen, on your knees." Marcus froze, his legs locked. His breath stopped. Because kneeling, he knew what that meant. Kneeling meant surrender. Kneeling meant vulnerability. Kneeling meant giving them the angle, the shot, the excuse. A memory flashed through him, his mother's voice, the night he turned 14. "If they ever stop you, always keep your hands visible. Don't argue. Don't reach for anything, and whatever you do, baby, don't run." He had followed every word. He had done everything right. And still he was here, knees. Now, Marcus slowly lowered himself, the pavement soaking through his jeans. His breath shook so violently he thought he might collapse. A small crowd began gathering across the street. A few people whispered. Some pulled out their phones. But no one stepped closer. Not yet. Lightning slashed the sky, followed by a distant rumble of thunder. Rain began to fall sharp, cold, merciless, stinging Marcus's neck as he knelt on the ground, palms raised. The officer behind him barked, "Hands behind your head." Marcus obeyed. He interlocked his fingers. He tried to stay calm, but he could hear the other officer breathing heavily, fingers twitching near the trigger. "Dispatch, we have a possible suspect male. Black resisting commands," the officer said into his radio. Marcus's head snapped up. "Resisting? I'm doing everything you asked." His voice cracked not with anger, but with pure, unfiltered fear. The officer took a step closer, boots splashing through the puddles. "Shut up." Marcus felt the cold, painful press of metal at the back of his neck. A gun. The unmistakable touch of death. His stomach twisted. His eyes stung. He wanted to scream. He tried to beg. He wanted to run. But all he could do was breathe small, shallow, brittle breaths. "Please," he whispered. "Please don't shoot me." The officer didn't respond. His silence was more terrifying than the shouting. Then a voice broke through the tension. A woman, shouting from across the street. "Hey, he lives here. I've seen him. What are you doing?" The officers turned for half a second. And in that half second, the world began to shift. More neighbors stepped forward, phones raised, hands pointing. "He didn't do anything. This is wrong. We're filming everything." The officer holding the gun hesitated, a crack in the armor of authority, a moment of doubt. But the second officer didn't like the power shift. He grabbed Marcus by the back of his jacket and yanked him to his feet. Marcus stumbled, nearly falling into the puddle at his feet. "I said stay down," the officer snapped. "I didn't move." Marcus cried out. The officer shoved him hard to hard, sending him crashing into the hood of the squad car. Pain shot through Marcus's ribs. His palms scraped against metal, gasped. But the officer pinned him there, pressing him down with a forearm that felt like a concrete wall. Rainwater dripped down Marcus's face, mixing with tears he couldn't stop. People across the street gasped. "Hey, you can't do that. He's not resisting. Let him go." Officer tightened his grip, whispering through gritted teeth. "You better pray I don't charge you for resisting arrest." Marcus shook his head. "Why? Why are you doing this? What did I do?" His voice echoed off the buildings, swallowed by thunder. No one answered. The officer finally released him just enough to yank his arms behind his back. Marcus winced as cold steel clamped around his wrists. Handcuffs, heavy, tight, final. The world blurred lights. Rain voices in. Suddenly Marcus was no longer a man trying to go home. He was a headline waiting to be written. A mother's worst nightmare. A statistic. A target. The officer shoved him again, put him in the car. Marcus stared at the crowd, the faces now filled with fear, outrage, helplessness. "Helplessness? We're not letting you take him. He didn't do anything." Another woman stepped onto the street, recording. We got you, sweetheart. We're filming everything. Stay calm. But the officers didn't slow down. The second officer opened the car's back door. Rain pounded the roof, drowning out Marcus's heartbeat. He looked into the dark interior of the squad car, a space where people disappeared, where stories changed, where lives ended. He felt something break inside him. Something small, something essential. Hope. But just as the officer grabbed the back of Marcus's collar to force him inside, a loud voice exploded behind them. ENOUGH. It wasn't from the crowd. It wasn't an officer. It was someone new. Someone authoritative. Someone who could change everything. A figure stepped through the falling rain, someone unexpected, someone Marcus recognized instantly, and the look on their face was not anger. It was fear. Fear for him. Marcus's breath caught in his throat as the figure approached faster, pushing past the growing crowd, hands raised. The officers stiffened. The crowd fell silent. The rain kept falling. Marcus whispered, barely audible, "Please, help me." The figure opened its mouth and then cut to black. A single line echoes in the darkness. What happened next would change everything. The moment the figure stepped forward through the rain, everything shifted. The officers loosened their grip, not out of guilt or shame, but out of recognition. The tension that had wrapped itself around the street began to crack, like a storm finally losing its strength. Marcus felt the hand on the back of his collar release, if only slightly, giving him the first full breath he'd had in minutes. The figure's voice shook not with fear of the officers, but with fear for Marcus. "Let him go," they said firmly. "He wasn't doing anything. I saw the whole thing." The officers exchanged glances. The second officer's jaw tightened, as if deciding whether to argue, deny, or escalate. But the crowd was larger now. Phones were everywhere. The truth had too many witnesses to be buried. Reluctantly, one officer stepped back. The other unlocked the cuffs with a loud metallic click. This sound should have meant freedom, but instead felt like a reminder of just how close Marcus had come to losing everything. As the steel loosened around his wrists, Marcus's knees nearly buckled. He steadied himself on the hood of the car, trying to swallow the shaking that had taken over his body. The officer muttered something, no apology, no explanation, just a frustrated grunt. The kind you make when something you wanted to control slips out of your hands. The crowd erupted. "That's right, let him go. You had no reason to stop him. We got everything on camera." Marcus didn't speak. Couldn't. His throat felt scraped, raw. There were 1,000 things he wanted to say, questions, accusations. Please, but his voice was lost somewhere between shock and exhaustion. The figure, his neighbor, Mrs. Turner, placed a trembling hand on his shoulder. "Come on, baby," she whispered gently. "Let's get you home." Home. The word felt too tender for the moment, too soft, too far away. But he nodded. He walked. Not because he felt safe, but because standing still felt like tempting fate. Every step away from the squad car felt unreal, like he was moving through a dream made of water and broken glass. The rain plastered his clothes to his body. His hands shook uncontrollably. His breath still came in short, uneven bursts. Behind him, the officers returned to their car. The lights dimmed. The engine hummed. Just like that, just as quickly as they had escalated the nightmare, they drove away. No report filed. No charges. No apology. Nothing. Just absence. But the damage had already been done. Inside his building, Marcus finally let himself collapse onto the stairs, sitting there in soaked jeans and shaking hands. Mrs. Turner sat beside him, rubbing his back as if trying to calm a child after a nightmare. But this wasn't a nightmare. This was reality. And it could have ended so differently. Marcus looked at his wrists, skin still red where the cuffs had bitten in. Proof. Evidence. A reminder that no matter how educated he was, how polite, how compliant, his life could still be taken in an instant. He whispered, "I did everything right." Mrs. Turner's eyes softened with a sadness far older than that night. "No, baby." "I know, because the truth was painful. Doing everything right had never been enough." For days afterwards, Marcus moved through life in a haze. He jumped at sudden noises. He avoided windows. He replayed the moment the gun touched the back of his neck, a phantom sensation he couldn't shake. And he kept hearing the officer's voice in his mind. Possible suspect, resisting commands, a rewrite of reality. A lie that almost became his last truth. Friends checked on him. His mother cried when she heard. His boss told him to take time off. But Marcus didn't want sympathy. He wanted answers. Why did walking home become a threat? Why did fear have to become second nature? Why did his skin color turn ordinary moments into battlegrounds? One evening, he walked to the mirror, not to fix anything, not to judge anything, but to see himself, really seize himself. Because the incident hadn't just shaken him, it had cracked something open, something profound, and inside that crack lived anger. But also clarity. He realized he could stay silent. He could pretend he was okay, could bury the fear, bury the humiliation, bury the reality of what had happened. But silence had never protected anyone like him. Silence had never saved a life. Silence made room for the following incident, and the next. So Marcus made a choice to speak. He attended a community meeting, then another, then another. He told his story not because he wanted attention, but because the truth needed a voice. His voice. The voice that rarely got another chance to speak at all. His story spread. People shared it online. Local activists reached out. A journalist contacted him. Councilwoman invited him to speak at a town hall. The same streets where he once walked in fear became the streets where he stood tall, sharing what had happened, demanding accountability, refusing to be erased or reduced to a statistic. And people listened. Some cried. Some apologized. Some reflected on things they had never thought about. Some realized the privilege of walking home without fear. Marcus didn't become an activist overnight, but he became something powerful. A reminder that these moments don't happen in isolation. A reminder that racism isn't always loud. It can be quiet, calculated, hidden behind badges and reports. A reminder that survival shouldn't feel like luck. A reminder that speaking up can save the next person. The next Marcus. He made it home that night, but he didn't come home the same. A part of him carried the weight of what almost happened. But another part carried a fire one that refused to let the moment disappear into silence. His story became more than a warning. It became a message, a call, a responsibility. Because this wasn't just his experience. It was the lived reality of millions. A cycle that keeps repeating. A fear passed down through generations. A truth too painful to ignore. And as Marcus stood at the podium during his first public talk, he ended with a question that echoed across the room, the city, the screen. How many more times will this happen, before the world finally decides it's one time too many? If this story moved you, don't let it end here. Please share it, talk about it, make sure you're subscribed to more stories that need to be heard. Change begins with awareness. Awareness begins with us.